Californians don't really flinch at stories like this anymore, and that familiarity is what makes it disturbing. When a factory that survived for 115 years quietly walks away from the state, the question isn't what went wrong. It is why everyone saw it coming and no one stopped it. Before we dive into the economic policies driving this exodus, make sure to hit that subscribe button for Tax Hack Pro. We break down the tax laws and corporate shifts that affect your job, your city, and your wallet. Leprino Foods didn't collapse. It didn't go bankrupt. They planned this exit meticulously. They finished a brand new $1 billion facility in Texas first. Only then did they tell California workers they had about a year to figure out what comes next. This isn't just a story about one factory leaving. It is a blueprint for how companies can now leave California quietly, without warning, without consequences. And while officials stay silent and treat this like business as usual, the pressure keeps building. Jobs keep disappearing. Which leads to the question Californians are starting to ask out loud. How many more companies leave before this finally gets called what it is, a real crisis? A 115-year-old factory just gave up on California. A 115-year-old factory just left California. What is unsettling isn't the closure itself. It is how quietly it happened. No chaos, no public fight. No warning early enough for workers to fully grasp what was unfolding. Everything moved smoothly, almost efficiently, as if the disappearance of a century-old economic pillar had somehow become acceptable. What needs to be said clearly is this. The company didn't fail. The factory didn't shut down because the business collapsed or demand dried up. The company behind it was strong enough to complete a brand new, more modern, more centralized facility in another state first. Only then did they announce that the California plant would be closed. By the time workers were told they had about a year to prepare for what comes next, the company's future had already been decided elsewhere. And this is where the story shifts. The issue isn't simply why a company left California. It is how it was able to leave without needing to explain much, without prolonged negotiation, and without fearing it would be stopped. For decades, factories like this were deeply tied to their local communities. They depended on nearby farmers, local labor, and existing infrastructure. Longevity created the assumption that the relationship went both ways. That model is fading. Today's large companies can consolidate production into massive, highly automated megaplants with tightly controlled supply chains and far less dependence on any single community. Once they reach that point, staying or leaving is no longer about loyalty or responsibility. It becomes a cost calculation. And when that calculation no longer favors California, the decision to leave becomes cold and fast. The cost of that decision doesn't show up on a balance sheet. It shows up in the lives left behind, in the communities that built their identity around a factory they believed would always be there. And this, in many ways, is only the beginning of the story. Leprino Foods left California before anyone was ready. This wasn't a sudden shutdown. It wasn't a decision made under last-minute pressure. What makes this story unsettling is how early the decision was made and how late the people affected were told. While workers in California were still showing up every morning, still building their lives around a factory they believed would be there for years to come, the company's real future was quietly being shaped somewhere else. By the time the closure was announced, the alternative was no longer a plan on paper. It had already been built. It was already operating. In reality, the exit had happened long before anyone here had time to prepare. And that detail completely changes how this story should be understood. Leprino Foods didn't leave California because it failed. It left because it no longer needed to stay. And that distinction is what caught so many people off guard. For decades, companies like this were assumed to be rooted in place. They relied on nearby dairy farms, local workers, and existing infrastructure. When a factory lasts more than 100 years, people don't see it as just a job site. It becomes part of the landscape, something permanent, a place to build an entire life around rather than something you prepare yourself to lose. But that assumption quietly collapsed. Instead of reinvesting in its aging California facility, the company made a colder, more modern calculation. It poured roughly $1 billion into a brand new mega plant in Texas. Designed from the ground up to be larger, more centralized, more automated, and far less dependent on any single community. By the time California workers were told they had about a year to plan what came next, the company's future had already been locked in elsewhere. The countdown for those left behind had already started. From the inside, that timing is devastating. Imagine spending 20 or 30 years at the same place, watching your parents retire from that factory, seeing new generations of workers come and go, pushing through recessions, rising costs, and endless assurances that things would eventually stabilize. Then one day, you are told the decision isn't up for discussion. It isn't up for negotiation or reversal. It is done, not it might happen, not it's under review, but a final outcome that is already sealed. How do you prepare for that? Especially when your skills are highly specialized and your options are limited. That is where the anger really comes from, not because the company left, but because it left before anyone else had a real chance to adjust. Before workers could retrain, before local governments could plan, before families could seriously consider selling a home, relocating, or abandoning retirement plans built over decades. The timeline wasn't designed around people. It was designed around efficiency, and once that efficiency was achieved somewhere else, everything left behind became replaceable. If you are concerned about how corporate tax incentives and state regulations are reshaping the job market, subscribe to Tax Hack Pro. We track these moves so you don't get blindsided. Up to this point, this looks like another company leaving, but that is not the real damage. In the past, exits like this were messy. Companies negotiated. They argued with local officials. They delayed, compromised, and explained themselves. That friction gave communities time to respond. This time, there was almost none. The announcement came, and the machinery of closure began moving almost immediately. No prolonged standoff, no genuine effort to keep operations local, just a clean cut that leaves people wondering what changed so much that a company no longer feels the need to justify its departure. Part of the answer lies in how modern manufacturing now works. With automation, centralized logistics, and massive processing capacity, a single megafacility can replace multiple regional plants. Once that model proves profitable, loyalty becomes optional, geography becomes flexible, and communities become interchangeable. In that reality, the people who lose the most aren't executives or shareholders. They are workers who are suddenly too old to start over easily, and towns that built their entire economic identity around an employer that no longer sees them as essential. A year's notice may sound generous on paper, but in real life it disappears quickly, especially for workers in their late 50s with highly specialized experience and no equivalent employer nearby. It disappears even faster when mortgages, healthcare, and retirement plans were built on the assumption that this job would last a few more years. And it isn't just workers who weren't ready. Cities weren't ready either. Local budgets depend heavily on anchor employers. When a factory leaves, infrastructure costs, utility expenses, and public services don't vanish. They get spread across fewer people. Rates go up, services get cut, and the ripple moves outward quietly but relentlessly. What makes this moment different and more troubling is how smooth the exit was. Efficient, clean, almost clinical. Because when companies realize they can leave first and explain later, the balance of power shifts. Decisions that once took years now take months. Communities that once had leverage now find out after everything is done. And workers who believed long service meant security discover that even 100 years of history is no longer protection. So the real question isn't why Leprino left California. The real question is, how many other companies have already made the same calculation, and how many people won't find out until it is too late to prepare? Leprino didn't just leave California. It left before anyone was ready. And that may be the clearest sign yet that the old rules no longer apply. The decision cost 368 families their future. 368. On paper, it is a clean number, easy to drop into a report, easy to read in a press release. But for the families who depended on that factory, that number never meant jobs. It meant an entire life structure that suddenly lost its support. It was the mortgage signed with the belief that this income would still be there. The health insurance tied to every shift worked. The retirement plans calculated year by year, month by month, with the quiet assumption that if they just held on a little longer, they would reach solid ground. When the decision came down, what disappeared wasn't just a paycheck. It was the sense of certainty they had carried for decades. What hurt the most wasn't that the company left, but how late people were told. Many stayed through hard years. They accepted overtime. They tightened their belts. They believed repeated assurances that the strain was temporary because they trusted that long-term loyalty still meant something. Most of them weren't at the beginning of their working lives. They were at the stage where stability matters more than opportunity. A year's notice sounds reasonable if you are reading from the outside. But when you're past 50 with highly specialized skills and a life rooted in one place, that year disappears before you have even figured out where you could possibly land. That is why the comments online don't sound panicked. They carry a different tone, heavier, quieter, more bitter. Not why did this happen, but of course it did, because the real fear isn't losing a job, it is realizing there may be nowhere left to fall safely. Retraining makes sense in presentations, but it feels hollow when you have spent 30 years mastering one production line, one system that no one else nearby needs. Moving sounds possible until you think about aging parents, a paid-off home, or medical care you can't simply replace somewhere else. For many families, the decision didn't open new doors. It quietly closed the ones they already had. The pressure doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps into daily life. Conversations at home change tone. Retirement plans get postponed, then postponed again, until no one wants to mention them. Savings that were meant to be a safety net suddenly have to cover the present. Stress shows up in small decisions, in delayed repairs, in nights spent reworking the numbers and realizing they no longer add up. This is the part that never appears in official statements, but it is the part viewers recognize instantly because they have lived some version of that uncertainty, or they can feel themselves moving closer to it. And the impact doesn't stop with individual households. When a stable, well-paying employer disappears, the entire community begins to wobble. Local businesses lose regular customers. Cities lose reliable tax revenue. Public services are trimmed quietly at first, then more noticeably. Those who can leave often do. Those who stay, many of them older, are left facing a reality where options shrink each year, while the cost of living keeps climbing. What makes this decision feel especially cruel isn't just the scale, it is the timing. The company's future had already been secured somewhere else long before these families were handed a deadline to fend for themselves, not because they failed, but because the rules changed without their consent. That is the feeling running underneath so many comments, not explosive anger, but a cold realization that doing everything right, working hard and staying loyal for decades, no longer guarantees safety. And once that realization takes hold, it doesn't just haunt the 368 families who lost their jobs. It spreads to everyone else who is quietly wondering whether, when their turn comes, they will have time to prepare at all. If decades of loyalty don't protect these families, what exactly are the rest of us working toward? What happens to a city when its best jobs disappear? A city doesn't die the day its best jobs disappear. It keeps functioning. It keeps moving. On the surface, it even looks normal. And that is what makes it dangerous. Because when there is no clear moment of collapse, it becomes easy to tell yourself this is just another rough patch that will eventually pass. But if the jobs that once held everything together are gone, then what is actually holding the city up now? At first, the loss is wrapped in softer language: restructuring, transition, economic adjustment. A few hundred jobs vanish, and people say the market will rebalance. That workers will find something else, that the city has survived worse. But who is saying that, and who is actually paying the price? Because for families who depended on those high-paying jobs, this adjustment isn't a concept, it is groceries. Rent, medical bills, and a future that keeps shrinking one decision at a time. When a city loses its best jobs, it doesn't just lose income, it loses stability. Those jobs were the ones that paid mortgages on time, supported local businesses without hesitation, and quietly generated the tax base that kept schools, roads, and public services running. Once that layer disappears, spending tightens, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to slow everything down. Small businesses feel it first. Repairs get postponed, plans get pushed back, and the question starts to form quietly but persistently. If the most stable people are cutting back, what happens to everyone else? Then the cuts begin, not all at once, and not in ways that spark outrage. Maintenance is delayed, hiring freezes appear. Programs are trimmed just enough to save money. At first, it feels manageable. That is the trap. Each cut on its own seems survivable, until people realize they are paying more for fewer services. And no one is really surprised anymore. And who absorbs that pressure? The people who can't leave, the ones who are older, rooted, and out of options. Over time, the city changes in ways that are hard to describe but impossible to ignore. Younger people leave first because they still can. What remains grows older, less flexible, and more exposed. Property values stall, then slide. Infrastructure ages faster than it is repaired. A place that once felt like it was moving forward starts to feel like it is waiting for something worse. And eventually, the question stops being when new jobs will arrive and becomes whether anyone is still willing to invest here at all. The most painful part is that there is almost never an equal replacement. Anchored jobs don't come back easily. When new employers show up, they tend to offer lower pay, fewer benefits, and far less security. They don't rebuild what was lost. They simply slow the fall. For workers who spent decades developing specialized skills, those jobs aren't a transition. They are a step backward. And that raises a hard question. Can a city really call this recovery if its people are just learning how to live with less? As the tax base weakens, the burden shifts to those who stay. Utility rates rise, fees increase, public services quietly shrink. Residents pay more for a city that gives them fewer reasons to stay. And over time, expectation turns into resignation, not because people don't care, but because hope starts to feel too expensive to hold on to. That is how cities hollow out, not through a dramatic collapse, but through accumulated erosion, one manageable decision stacked on top of the last. And by the time it becomes clear how fragile the city has become, the jobs that once held it together are long gone. At that point, the final question isn't why this happened, but whether it is time to stop calling it a transition and start admitting what it really is: decline, why this will make food more expensive for everyone. When a major food processor leaves, the first instinct is to see it as a local problem, something that hurts one town and a few hundred families, but food doesn't work that way. The moment production shifts out of a region, the costs don't disappear. They spread, quietly and efficiently, until everyone feels them at the checkout line. The simplest part is transportation. When cheese, milk, or any processed food is no longer made close to where it is consumed, it has to travel farther, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of miles. That means more fuel, more trucks, more drivers, more delays, and more opportunities for disruption. Each added mile may look insignificant on its own, but stacked across millions of pounds of food, it becomes real money, and that money doesn't come out of corporate margins for long. It gets passed down, then there is capacity. When a large facility shuts down, the remaining plants don't suddenly gain extra breathing room. They get busier, production concentrates, schedules tighten. Any disruption, whether it is weather, labor shortages, or equipment failure, hits harder because there is less slack in the system. When supply becomes more fragile, prices become more volatile. That is when temporary increases start turning into permanent ones. There is also the loss of proximity. Local processors once acted as buffers between farms and consumers, absorbing shocks and stabilizing supply. When that link breaks, farmers have fewer buyers and longer routes to market, while retailers depend on more distant suppliers. The system becomes less flexible and more expensive to operate, even when demand stays the same. So when people ask why food prices keep creeping up even when nothing seems obviously wrong, this is part of the answer. Fewer local processors means longer supply chains, tighter margins, and less resilience. And once food production moves away, it rarely comes back. The question isn't whether prices will rise. It is how often and how quickly those increases become the new normal for everyone. California officials stayed silent. And that is the scariest part. The most unsettling part of this story isn't that a major employer left California. It is that almost no one in power seemed compelled to say anything meaningful about it. No urgency, no warning, no serious explanation, just silence, as if the loss of a century-old factory and hundreds of stable jobs was something too ordinary to interrupt the day's agenda. That silence lands harder than any press release ever could, because it tells people exactly where they stand. When workers are given deadlines, families are forced to scramble, and entire cities start bracing for fallout, the absence of leadership doesn't feel neutral. It feels like abandonment. And once people notice it, they don't forget. In moments like this, people aren't looking for perfect solutions. They are looking for acknowledgement. They want to hear that someone understands what is at stake, that someone is paying attention to the damage unfolding in real time. Instead, what they see is a vacuum. No clear plan to stop the next exit. No honest admission that the system is pushing companies out faster than communities can adapt. Just carefully chosen words, or worse, none at all. That is why the reaction isn't explosive anger. It is something colder. A quiet realization that if a 115-year-old factory can disappear without triggering alarms, then nothing is truly protected anymore. If hundreds of families can be displaced without a public reckoning, then the safety net people thought existed may never have been there in the first place. Silence sends a message, whether it is intended or not. It tells workers that loyalty doesn't buy visibility. It tells cities that they are on their own. And it tells everyone else watching that if this happens to them next, they shouldn't expect much help when it does. If there is one thing this story forces us to confront, it is that these are no longer isolated incidents. They are part of a pattern that keeps repeating, moving faster each time, with less explanation, and more damage left behind. When companies leave quietly, when communities are left to fend for themselves, and when those who should speak up choose not to, the cost always falls on the people with the fewest options. If you are wondering whether this could happen where you live to the job you rely on, then you already understand why this story matters. Take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Tax Hack Pro, and stay with us. Because understanding what is happening early can make the difference between being prepared and being blindsided when it is already too late. We will keep tracking these economic shifts so you know what is coming. I'm the Tax Hack Pro. Protect your job, protect your community, and I'll see you in the next video.